They weren't the ones that betrayed us. Remember, Wolffe. Remember. Rex says this to a man who's spiraling. A man who just saw a Jedi walk onto their ATTE and immediately transmitted their coordinates to the Empire. 15 years after the Clone Wars ended, and Wolffe is still flinching at the sight of a lightsaber, still treating every Force sensitive like a threat, still carrying wounds that removing a chip from his skull couldn't begin to heal. But here's what most people miss about that line. Rex isn't asking Wolffe to remember facts. He's not saying, remember the war, or remember what really happened, or even, remember who the real enemy was. He's asking something far more personal, far more painful. He's asking Wolffe to remember who he was, before the chip fired, before Order 66 turned millions of clones into assassins, before Wolffe watched the only Jedi who ever treated him like a person fall from the sky, shot down by pilots wearing the same armor, following the same programming, serving the same battalion that Wolffe had commanded for 3 years. Remember isn't about loyalty or history or even the truth about who betrayed whom. It's about identity. It's about reclaiming something that was stolen so completely, most clones never knew they'd lost it. And understanding why 3 clones out of millions chose to cut into their own skulls, chose brain surgery over obedience, chose freedom over the only purpose they'd ever known, requires understanding what they were trying to remember in the first place, what they were trying to get back. Let's start with a number that should haunt you. 3. 3 clones removed their inhibitor chips and lived to fight another day. Rex, Wolffe, Gregor. Out of an army grown in the millions on the storm-swept oceans of Camino, genetically identical soldiers who fought and bled and died across 1,000 battlefields spanning 3 brutal years. Only 3 successfully cut out the organic implant buried in their temporal regions and walked away with their minds intact. Not 3%, not 3,000, 3. The chips were grown inside them. That's the part people forget when they discuss Order 66, like it was just a command sequence, just programming, just something that could have been overridden with enough willpower or the right motivation. These weren't mechanical devices inserted after birth. They weren't hardware that could be detected on a scanner and questioned during a medical exam. The Kaminoan scientists cultivated them during the earliest stages of fetal development. Organic components, positioned deep in the brain's temporal region, integrated so completely with the clone's neural tissue that by the time a trooper emerged from his growth acceleration chamber and began combat training, the chip had already been part of his biology for years. It was as much a part of him as his lungs, as his heartbeat, as the face he shared with millions of brothers. The official explanation, given to the Jedi Council by the Kaminoans, was that the chips tempered aggressive tendencies inherited from the clone's genetic template, the bounty hunter Jango Fett. The Jedi accepted this. Why wouldn't they? The clones seemed loyal, seemed devoted, seemed like exactly what the Republic needed to fight its war. The true purpose was known only to Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who had commissioned the entire army through his apprentice Count Dooku in 32 BBY, a full decade before the Clone Wars began. A decade of growing weapons that wouldn't know they were weapons until the moment they were fired. And when Order 66 was transmitted, when that single phrase activated chips across the entire galaxy simultaneously, the horror of it wasn't that clones became mindless automatons. The horror was worse. The chips created what the historical sources call a compulsion layer, an irresistible directive that overrode the clone's conscious will while leaving his awareness largely intact. The clone would know what he was doing. He would recognize the Jedi he was shooting. He would remember every shared meal, every firefight survived together, every moment of trust built across years of war. He would remember the Jedi saving his life. He would remember fighting back-to-back against impossible odds. He would remember the quiet conversations after battles, the small kindnesses, the sense that maybe, just maybe, his life meant something to someone. And he would be unable to stop himself from pulling the trigger. Imagine that for a moment. Really sit with it. Watching through your own eyes as your hands murder someone you love. screaming inside your own skull as your body follows orders your mind never agreed to. Being trapped in flesh that no longer belongs to you, a prisoner in the body you were born into, forced to witness yourself become a killer. That's what Order 66 felt like. That's what Rex, Wolffe, and Gregor cut out of their own heads. So when we ask how these three were convinced to remove their chips, we're asking the wrong question. We're treating it like a logical decision, like someone presented arguments and evidence and the clones weighed the pros and cons before scheduling surgery. That's not how it happened. Not for any of them. They were convinced by something that came earlier. Something that had nothing to do with medical procedures or conspiracy evidence or understanding what the chips actually were. They were convinced by the simple, radical, almost unthinkable experience of being treated like they mattered. And for Wolffe, that experience had a name. Plo Koon. The year was 22 BBY, first year of the Clone Wars. Clone Commander CC-3636, who had taken the name Wolffe, as all clones eventually took names to distinguish themselves from their identical brothers, served under Jedi General Plo Koon as leader of the 104th Battalion's elite Wolfpack squad. The relationship that would define Wolffe's entire existence crystallized during a catastrophic engagement in the Abrogado system. Plo Koon's task force had been dispatched to investigate the disappearance of a Republic fleet. Standard reconnaissance. Should have been routine. What they found was the Malevolence, a separatist warship the size of nightmares, equipped with twin ion pulse cannons capable of disabling entire fleets in a single blast. No warning shots, no demands for surrender. The Malevolence simply fired. The ion pulse swept through Plo Koon's ships like a wave of death. Power systems died, life support failed, engines went dark, and in the debris field that followed, a graveyard of disabled cruisers and dying men, separatist vulture droids moved through systematically, destroying escape pods, hunting down survivors, ensuring that no one would live to report what they had seen. Wolffe, Plo Koon, and two troopers named Sinker and Boost made it into a damaged life pod. Power cells failing, oxygen reserves limited, hunter-killer pods closing in on every side. They were already dead. This was just the waiting. And in that cramped pod, drifting through wreckage and corpses, Sergeant Sinker gave voice to what every clone trooper had been taught about their place in the galaxy since the moment they could understand language. "We're just clones, sir. We're meant to be expendable." It wasn't self-pity. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement of fact as the clones understood it. They were products, resources, manufactured for a specific purpose and valued only insofar as they fulfilled that purpose. When a clone died, you requisitioned another. When a unit was wiped out, you ordered replacements. The math was simple. Clones cost credits to produce, but not enough credits to make their individual survival a priority. Expendable. Plo Koon's response was immediate. Absolute. 3 words that would echo through Wolffe's entire existence, that would become the foundation of an identity most clones never got to build. Not to me. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain or justify or qualify. He didn't say, not to the Republic, or not in theory, or not when there are cameras watching. He said, not to me. Personal, specific. A statement about his own values, his own beliefs, his own relationship with the men who served under him. Their lives had worth. Their survival mattered. They were not expendable to this Jedi. They were individuals whose deaths would be mourned, whose lives would be protected, whose existence meant something beyond their utility as soldiers. Plo Koon then insisted that rescue would come, that Anakin Skywalker and his Padawan Ahsoka Tano would search for them despite orders to abandon the area. The clones had reason for doubt. The Republic didn't typically waste resources searching for common soldiers in situations where survival was statistically unlikely. But Plo Koon believed, and his belief proved correct. Anakin and Ahsoka came, against orders, against probability, against the cold mathematics that should have written off Plo Koon's survivors as acceptable losses. Wolffe lived because a Jedi refused to accept that clone lives were disposable. Here's what makes this honestly heartbreaking. What makes the Wolffe-Plo Koon relationship the emotional centerpiece of any discussion about chip removal, even though most analysis of Order 66 never mentions it. Plo Koon didn't just say those words once and move on. He didn't treat "not to me" as a motivational speech delivered in a crisis and forgotten once the crisis passed. He lived it. Every day. For 3 years of brutal, grinding warfare. Plo Koon led rescue missions to extract stranded clone units when other commanders would have marked them as lost. He mourned individual troopers by name when they fell, not with generic acknowledgement of sacrifice, but with genuine grief for specific people whose voices he would never hear again. He listened to his clones' tactical suggestions, remembered their personal preferences, treated their opinions as valuable intelligence rather than background noise from the help. The Wolffe Pack responded with something that transcended ordinary military loyalty. They painted their armor in Plo Koon's colors, the distinctive gray and blue that marked them as his soldiers, his troops, his people. They took pride in their assignment not merely as elite warriors, but as the unit of a Jedi who saw them as human. Well, human enough. The clones weren't quite human, weren't quite anything else. Existed in a category the galaxy didn't have clean language for. But Plo Koon treated them like they belonged to that category anyway. Wolffe internalized this relationship at the deepest level of his identity. He wasn't merely a clone. He wasn't merely a commander. He was someone whose life Plo Koon had declared valuable, and that declaration gave him a foundation for selfhood that most clones never possessed. Most clones knew what they were worth. A line item in a budget, a number in a casualty report, a statistic that mattered only in aggregate. Wolffe knew something different. Wolffe knew that at least one person in the galaxy would miss him if he died. That knowledge changed everything. When the chip fired 3 years later, that foundation didn't protect him. It made the horror infinitely worse. Rex's path to chip removal ran through a dead man's warning and the longest 3 years of his life. ARC Trooper CT-5555 Fives discovered the chips existed during the final year of the Clone Wars, 19 BBY. The discovery began with a catastrophic malfunction. Clone Trooper Tup, a member of the 501st Legion serving under Captain Rex and General Anakin Skywalker, experienced something no clone had experienced before. During combat on the planet Ringo Vinda, his inhibitor chip degraded and activated prematurely. Tup entered a fugue state, approached Jedi General Tiplar without warning, and executed her in front of dozens of witnesses. He had no memory of the killing afterward, no explanation, no motive. He just kept repeating a phrase that would come to haunt the surviving clones who heard it. Good soldiers follow orders. Then he collapsed. Fives refused to accept that his brother had simply gone insane, refused to accept the official story of a stress-induced breakdown, of combat fatigue pushed past the breaking point. Something was wrong, something deeper than trauma, something mechanical in the way Tup had moved and spoken. Fives investigated. He demanded medical examinations. He pushed past every obstacle thrown in his path by commanding officers who wanted the incident buried and forgotten. The investigation led him to Kamino, where Kaminoan scientists recognized immediately what Fives was close to discovering. They tried to suppress his findings. They claimed Tup's condition resulted from a rare parasitic infection. They performed surgery to remove what they called a tumor from Tup's brain. Tup died on the operating table, but Fives had seen the tumor before it was extracted. It wasn't a tumor. It was a chip, an organic implant, grown into the brain's structure, degraded from years of function, but still recognizably artificial, recognizably designed. Fives kept digging. He removed his own chip to prove the procedure was survivable. He uncovered evidence of a conspiracy stretching back to the Army's creation in 32 BBY. Evidence that the chips weren't safeguards against genetic aggression, that they were control mechanisms embedded in every clone who had ever been grown in Kamino's facilities. Weapons waiting to be fired. He tried to warn everyone who would listen. The Jedi Council, the military command, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine himself. Palpatine, of course, was the Sith Lord who had commissioned the chips in the first place. Darth Sidious, in his decades-long disguise, the patient architect of the Republic's destruction, who had spent 10 years building an army that would execute his final order without hesitation or resistance. Fives was cornered on Coruscant, discredited as unstable, hunted by the very institutions he was trying to protect. Commander Fox of the Coruscant Guard received orders to apprehend him, alive if possible, but dead if necessary. In his final moments, Fives managed to reach Rex and Anakin Skywalker. He was desperate, incoherent, raving about conspiracies that sounded impossible. The chips would be used against the Jedi. The entire army was compromised. Something terrible was coming, something built into them from birth, something they couldn't fight because they didn't even know it was there. Before he could explain the full scope of what he'd discovered, before he could give Rex the evidence he needed to convince others, the specific details that would have made his warning actionable, Commander Fox shot him. Fives died in Rex's arms. His final words were a warning. His final moments were spent looking up at a brother who couldn't fully understand what he was being told. And Rex, good soldier, loyal captain, the man Fives had trusted enough to reach out to in his last desperate hours, Rex heard the warning. He couldn't accept it. Not fully. The conspiracy Fives described was too vast, too impossible, too fundamental an indictment of everything Rex had built his life around. The entire army was compromised? Every clone carried a chip that would turn them against the Jedi? The war itself was a trap? It couldn't be true. It was too terrible to be true. But Rex remembered. He remembered his brother's face as he died, the conviction in his voice, the certainty that Fives had believed every word, had died trying to deliver a message that Rex wasn't ready to hear. Rex remembered. That memory saved his life. The Siege of Mandalore, last major operation of the Clone Wars. A joint Republic Mandalorian force, commanded by Ahsoka Tano, no longer a Jedi, but fighting alongside them anyway, and clone Captain Rex of the 332nd Company, besieged the Shadow Collective forces occupying the planet under Darth Maul's leadership. The siege succeeded. Maul was captured. The Clone Wars appeared to be nearing their long-awaited end. Rex was aboard the Venator-class Star Destroyer Tribunal with Ahsoka, escorting their prisoner back to Coruscant when the transmission came. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, having declared himself Emperor, having transformed the Republic into the Galactic Empire in a single session of emergency legislation, issued Order 66 to all clone units across the galaxy. The chips activated simultaneously. Clones who had served alongside Jedi for years, who had eaten meals with them and fought beside them and trusted them with their lives, turned their weapons on their generals without hesitation. Across 1,000 battlefields, Jedi fell. In the halls of the temple on Coruscant, in command posts on distant moons, in starfighters and medical bays, and everywhere else the war had scattered them, they died. Shot in the back by the soldiers they had led. Rex was on the tribunal's bridge when his chip fired. His weapon rose toward Ahsoka, his body prepared to execute the order. And something impossible happened. Rex fought. For a handful of seconds, seconds that the chip's designers had never anticipated, seconds that shouldn't have been possible, Rex struggled against the compulsion burning through his neural pathways. Tears streamed down his face. His hands shook as they tried to aim. And in that narrow window of resistance, he forced out words that his chip desperately did not want him to speak. "Find him," Rex gasped. "Find Fives." Then the chip's control reasserted itself completely. Rex was lost. His finger moved toward the trigger. His face went blank. Another good soldier, following orders. But Ahsoka had heard him. She understood immediately what Rex had done, understood that he had given her critical information in the only window where his mind was still partially his own. She stunned him into unconsciousness and ran. What followed was depicted in Clone Wars Season 7, Episodes 11 and 12, Shattered and Victory and Death, which aired in 2020 as part of the show's revival on Disney+. The finale that fans had waited 7 years to see since the 2013 cancellation that had left the story incomplete. Ahsoka, with the assistance of astromech droids R7A7, RGG-1, and CH-33P, located files relating to Fives' investigation, the conspiracy he had uncovered, the chips, the procedure for removing them. The droids scanned Rex's brain and identified the chip's location, right temporal region, 90 degrees from his right orbital floor, exactly where Fives' research said it would be. While Ahsoka defended the medical bay from clone troopers hammering at the doors, soldiers following Order 66, trying to complete their mission, trying to kill the woman Rex had spent 3 years fighting beside, the droids performed surgery. The chip came out. Rex woke to freedom. His first words were an apology for nearly killing her. His second question was about the scope. How many clones carried chips? How many had been programmed? How big was this? Ahsoka told him the truth. Every single one. Every clone in the Grand Army of the Republic. Millions of soldiers, all carrying organic implants in their skulls, all now hunting Jedi across the galaxy. Rex and Ahsoka escaped the Star Destroyer as it crashed on a moon, faking their deaths in the wreckage. The Republic had become the Empire. The Jedi were being exterminated. And Rex carried within him the knowledge of how to free other clones from their programming. Here's the thing about Rex's chip removal that people don't discuss enough. He wasn't convinced. He couldn't be. When the chip was active, Rex's mind wasn't his own. There was no rational deliberation possible, no weighing of options, no moment of choice. Ahsoka made the decision for him. She removed his chip without his consent because consent was impossible. Because the alternative was letting her friend spend the rest of his life as a slave to programming he'd never agreed to. But once Rex experienced freedom, once he felt his autonomous will return and understood what the chip had nearly made him do, he was convinced at the deepest possible level. Not by arguments or evidence, by experience. By knowing what it felt like to be a prisoner in his own body, watching through his own eyes as his hands betrayed him. He knew Fives had been right about everything, and he knew exactly what he had to do next. While Rex's chip was being removed on a crashing warship, Plo Koon was dying on Cato Nemoidia. The planet's distinctive bridge cities stretched between massive rock formations, architectural marvels connecting natural spires across chasms miles deep. Plo Koon was conducting a post-battle patrol flight, routine reconnaissance over one such bridge, when Order 66 reached his wingmen. Clone pilots, 104th Battalion soldiers, men who had served under Plo Koon for 3 years, men who had heard him say, "Not to me," and believed it meant something. Their weapons locked on. They fired. The Jedi Master's starfighter lost control. It spiraled down toward the bridge structure, trailing smoke and flame. The impact was devastating. The explosion was immediate. Plo Koon, who had pulled Wolffe from a dying escape pod, who had insisted that clone lives had value, who had treated his troops as people rather than products for every day of a 3-year war, died because of what the chips made his own men do, killed by the clones who loved him. Wolffe's precise location during Order 66 isn't confirmed in the historical record, but we know this. The 104th Battalion executed the order. Plo Koon was killed by pilots of that battalion. Wolffe survived, and something broke. The relationship that had given Wolffe his foundation, the identity built on "not to me," the selfhood that emerged from being valued as an individual, was weaponized by the chip into the destruction of that very foundation. The trust Plo Koon had built over 3 years of war became the mechanism of his murder. Imagine being Wolffe. Imagine spending 3 years believing you mattered to someone, believing your life had value beyond your utility, believing that at least one person in the galaxy would mourn you if you died. Then imagine watching that person die because of what the chip in your head made your brothers do. Or worse, because of what it made you do. The presence of a Jedi became associated with the worst moment of Wolffe's existence. The face of a lightsaber wielder triggered not memories of rescue and respect, but memories of helpless horror as everything good in his life was destroyed. The pieces wouldn't fit back together the same way. They never would. Gregor's story runs parallel but distinct. A different kind of breaking and a different path to freedom. Clone Commando CC 557639, Gregor, had his entire unit wiped out during a classified operation. He was left for dead on Abafar, a worthless desert planet in the Outer Rim, notable primarily for its vast emptiness and complete lack of strategic value. The trauma erased everything. Complete amnesia. Gregor couldn't remember his name, his training, his brothers, his identity as a clone trooper, his existence as anything other than what he currently was, a man washing dishes in a diner called Power Sliders, working for a Sullustan proprietor named Borkus, answering to a name he didn't remember choosing. The commando training remained buried somewhere in his muscle memory, reflexes that occasionally surfaced in moments of stress, but his conscious identity had been wiped clean. He was nobody from nowhere, living a small life in a place that didn't matter. Recovery came accidentally in 20 BBY, when a Republic intelligence mission brought Colonel Meeber Gascon and D-Squad, a unit of droids, to Abafar. Gregor encountered evidence of his former life, his own commando armor, hidden in Borkus's back room. The armor triggered fragments. Memory started returning. When separatist forces threatened to overwhelm D-Squad's escape, Gregor chose to provide covering fire. He donned his commando armor for the first time since the amnesia began and fought with everything he had. The droids escaped. The Rhydonium mining facility exploded. Gregor was caught in the blast. He survived. 34 replies in one comment section asked, "Gregor, he survived?" And yes, against all odds, he did. But the explosion caused significant brain damage that affected his personality and cognitive function for the rest of his life. That damage had an unintended secondary effect. It disrupted his inhibitor chip. But here's what most people don't know. Gregor's story didn't end on Abafar. When Order 66 was issued, Gregor's damaged chip didn't fully activate. He retained more autonomous control than most clones. But rather than escaping the Empire entirely, Gregor ended up serving it, as a TK trooper instructor on the planet Darrow, training the next generation of Imperial stormtroopers. The chip was damaged, not destroyed. Gregor followed orders. He served the institution that had grown him, even as that institution transformed into something darker than the Republic had ever been. He trained conscript soldiers to fight for an empire built on the ashes of everything the clones had supposedly been fighting for. Liberation came when Clone Force 99, the Bad Batch, a squad of genetically enhanced clones who had also escaped Order 66's full effects, encountered Gregor during a mission to Darrow. The encounter reminded Gregor of who he had been before the Empire, before the Orders, before his damaged chip had left him trapped in a gray zone between slavery and freedom. He defected. He escaped. He found his way to Rex. And Rex, carrying the medical knowledge from his own liberation and Fives' research, completed what the explosion on Abafar had started. Gregor's chip came out. The damage was made permanent. Whatever Gregor chose going forward would be his choice alone. The three of them settled on Selos. Desert planet. Outer Rim. No Imperial presence worth mentioning. They acquired a modified ATTE walker, a relic of the Clone Wars, stripped of its military hardware and converted into something like a home, and established a life hunting Jupa, massive creatures that burrowed beneath Selos's desert surface. They lived simply. They tried to forget. 3 freed men. 3 clones who had cut the chains from their own skulls. 3 brothers who had found each other across the vast darkness of an empire that had stolen everything else from them. Rex carried the memory of Fives dying in his arms. Wolffe carried the memory of Plo Koon falling from the sky. Gregor carried fragments of a life he still couldn't fully remember, and brain damage that made him unpredictable, erratic, somehow more alive than anyone had a right to be after everything he'd survived. They didn't talk about what they had done during Order 66. They didn't have to. Then the Jedi came back. 4 BBY. Star Wars Rebels, Season 2, Episode 1, The Lost Commanders. A small rebel cell arrived on Selos seeking military intelligence. Old Republic tactical data that might help their fight against the Empire. Among the rebels was a man named Kanan Jarrus, actually Caleb Doom, a Jedi Padawan who had survived Order 66 at 14 years old, who had watched his master die at clone hands, who had spent 15 years hiding his identity and hating every soldier who had worn the armor. Rex saw potential allies. The rebellion against the Empire represented everything his liberation had been pointing toward, a cause worth choosing, a fight that mattered, a purpose that honored the brothers who had died, still enslaved by their chips. Wolffe saw a Jedi. His fractured psychology screamed danger. 15 years of trauma roared back in an instant. The presence of a Jedi meant death, meant loss, meant watching everything you loved destroyed by your own helpless hands. Wolffe transmitted their location to the Empire. They weren't the ones that betrayed us. Remember, Wolffe, remember. Now you understand what that line means. Rex isn't asking Wolffe to remember events. Not the Malevolence Rescue, not the Siege of Mandalore, not Order 66 itself. He's not asking Wolffe to remember that Jedi were allies, or that the Empire was the enemy, or that they should be fighting on the same side. He's asking Wolffe to remember the foundation, the identity, the man who existed before a chip in his brain turned him into something he never chose to be. Remember who you were when Plo Koon said, "Not to me." Remember that you were a person before they made you a weapon. Remember that removing the chip wasn't about mechanics or medical procedures or conspiracy theories. It was about reclaiming something that was stolen. Your will, your choices, yourself. 3 clones out of millions cut into their own skulls. Rex because Ahsoka made the choice for him when he couldn't make it himself. Gregor because an explosion broke something inside him and Rex finished the job years later. Wolffe because Rex showed up with a surgery kit and a question that no clone was ever supposed to be able to ask. Do you want to be free? They weren't convinced by arguments or evidence or tactical analysis. They were convinced by the one thing clone troopers were never supposed to have: a reason to believe they mattered. Plo Koon gave Wolffe that reason in a dying escape pod. Not to me. 3 words that created a foundation for selfhood, a basis for identity, a recognition that this particular clone's life had value, independent of his military function. Fives gave Rex that reason with his final breath. A brother who died trying to deliver a warning, who believed Rex was worth reaching out to, who trusted that at least one clone would remember what he'd discovered. Gregor found it in the fragments of a life he couldn't fully remember, in commando armor hidden in a back room, in reflexes that surfaced when he needed them, in the sense that he had been someone worth being before the galaxy took that someone away. The chip removal was just the physical part. The conviction came earlier. The conviction came from someone, anyone, treating them like their lives had value beyond their utility. One more thing. A question that hangs over all of this, that 35 comment replies engaged with, but nobody can fully answer. Did Rex ever learn that Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader? The canonical record is unclear. Rex encountered Imperial forces during his time with the Rebellion. Ahsoka certainly learned the truth during her confrontation with Vader on Malachor, That terrible moment when her former master's mask cracked and she saw the face beneath. Whether she told Rex, whether Rex figured it out himself, whether he lived his final years knowing that the general he had served, the man who had trusted him with Fives' dying warning, the Jedi who had been there when everything fell apart. We don't know for certain, but think about what it would mean if he did. Rex removed his chip to stop himself from killing Ahsoka. He spent the rest of his life fighting an empire that his former general now served. If Rex learned the truth about Anakin, learned that the man who'd fought beside him had become the Empire's greatest weapon, that's a wound that never heals. That's a remember Rex would carry to his grave. They weren't the ones that betrayed us. The chips betrayed us. The Sith Lord who designed them betrayed us. The system that grew us in tanks and programmed us from birth and sent us to die for a republic that was already dead betrayed us. But we got out. 3 of us. Anyway. 3 out of millions. And if you want to know how we were convinced, it wasn't the surgery that did it. It wasn't understanding the mechanics or seeing the medical scans or accepting the evidence of a galaxy-spanning conspiracy. It was knowing that someone, somewhere, had looked at us and seen people. That's what Rex is asking Wolffe to remember. Not the war, not the trauma, not even the truth about who was really responsible for Order 66. He's asking Wolffe to remember the moment before all of it went wrong. The moment when a Jedi said, "Not to me," and meant every word. The moment when a clone learned, really learned, deep in his bones, that his life had value. That's worth remembering. That's worth cutting into your own skull to protect. That's what made 3 out of millions choose to be free. Subscribe for more stories like this.